Welcome to Counterpunch. Today, we are diving deep into the tactical genius. Let's begin. Let's start with a man many consider the greatest counterpuncher of his generation, Juan Manuel Marquez. What made Marquez so terrifying wasn't just power. It was patience. It was geometry. It was the ability to read an opponent's rhythm and punish the smallest mistake with surgical precision. The clearest example of this is the fourth and final fight against Manny Pacquiao. For 3 fights, Pacquiao had been a problem Marquez couldn't fully solve. He'd come close, he'd shared rounds, but the finishing touch always eluded him. Then, in the 6th round of that 4th encounter, everything Marquez had studied about Pacquiao's tendencies converged into a single moment. Pacquiao came forward, as he always did, looking to close distance and unload. But Marquez didn't retreat in a straight line, which is the most common and most dangerous mistake fighters make against pressure fighters. Instead, he half-twisted his body, subtly rotating his hips and shoulders to create an angle. As Pacquiao's punch was already doesn't rush his work. Watch any of his knockouts and you'll notice he doesn't overcommit emotionally. He continues to move, continues to assess, because he understands that an opponent who appears finished can sometimes still have one dangerous reflex action left in them. That discipline, the refusal to get emotionally hijacked by his own success mid-fight, is part of what made him so difficult to counter himself. This counterpunching identity wasn't built in one night against Pacquiao. It was forged over years against some of the most aggressive volume punchers in the sport, including Juan Diaz. Against Diaz, a fighter who threw an enormous number of punches with constant forward pressure, Marquez had to develop mid-range setups that could function under sustained fire. He became expert at using sneaky left uppercuts, thrown almost as feelers, to interrupt Diaz's rhythm and create just enough separation. Immediately after, he'd follow with crisp overhand rights that traveled over Diaz's guard rather than through it. This 1-2 of an uppercut to disrupt followed by an overhand to finish became a recurring signature, a way of solving the problem of an opponent who simply wouldn't stop coming. What ties this entire section together is the idea that counterpunching at the elite level isn't reactive in a way casual fans assume. It's not simply waiting and reacting. It's proactive patience, studying tendencies in advance, recognizing the specific pattern when it appears live, and committing to the technical solution without hesitation once the window opens. Marquez didn't get lucky against Pacquiao. He got rewarded for a blueprint he'd been building for years. If Marquez represents calculated patience, Canelo Alvarez represents something different. A fighter who can identify a vulnerability almost instantly and end a fight before it has a chance to develop into a chess match. The fight against James Kirkland is the perfect demonstration of this. Kirkland came into that bout with a well-documented history of early round vulnerability. He was a fighter who fought with aggression and emotion from the opening bell, often at the expense of defending the pocket against a known vulnerability. A fighter who'd moved up significantly in weight to challenge for the light heavyweight title. Kovalev was bigger, had a notable size and power advantage on paper, and for the first several rounds, that advantage showed. Canelo took real punishment, got hurt, and had to survive moments where a lesser fighter might have folded. But rather than panicking or trying to force something prematurely, Canelo stayed patient, continuing to study Kovalev's footwork and output across the rounds, waiting for the moment when Kovalev's pace would naturally begin to dip. When that moment arrived in the 11th round, Canelo didn't ease into it. He shifted gears suddenly, what commentators have since described as throwing it into 5th gear, unloading a sudden and explosive combination that Kovalev, now fatigued and not expecting the shift in tempo, simply couldn't defend. The knockout looked sudden to anyone watching casually, but it was a product of 10 rounds of patient information gathering before the trigger was finally pulled. What unites all 3 of these examples is a fighter who considered one of the most dangerous punchers in the super featherweight division, a fighter with genuine power and a style built on applying pressure. Many expected Valdez to struggle with the physical demands of staying in range against him. Instead, Valdez fought what can only be described as a perfect mobile fight. He used lateral movement to stay just outside Berchelt's most comfortable punching range, never allowing Berchelt to settle into a consistent rhythm. Crucially, Valdez didn't just run. He built his own offensive rhythm from the outside, establishing a rigid, consistent jab that served 2 purposes. It kept Burchell's hands occupied with defense, and it allowed Valdez to measure distance precisely, round after round. Then, in the 10th round, all of that patient rhythm building paid off in a single moment. Valdez landed a perfectly placed left hook that caught Burchell clean. The technical brilliance of the punch lay in its setup. Burchell's guard and balance had been conditioned over 9 rounds to anticipate the jab, and straight punches Valdez had been consistently using to control range. When the left hook arrived instead, thrown with full hip rotation and timed perfectly off Valdez's footwork, Burchell had no defensive answer prepared. He went down completely, in one of the most replayed knockouts in recent boxing memory. Valdez's tactical toolkit doesn't stop at the conventional stance, either. He's shown a willingness to switch into a southpaw stance mid-fight, a tactic that immediately scrambles an opponent's defensive calibration. Fighters train extensively against orthodox opponents, building instinctive reactions to where punches will come from based on stance. When Valdez shifts to southpaw, even temporarily, those instinctive reactions become slightly miscalibrated. He's used this shift specifically to open lanes for thoughtful uppercut combinations, punches that come from unexpected angles and catch opponents whose guards are positioned for a different stance entirely. Perhaps the most underrated aspect of Valdez's finishing ability, though, is what he did against Matias Rueda. In that fight, Valdez showed a more sophisticated form of misdirection. A sustained, repetitive attack with left hooks to the head, round after round. On the surface, this looked like a straightforward, if relentless, head-hunting strategy. But it was deception. Each repeated head hook was training Ruda's guard to stay high, to anticipate the same shot again and again. Once that pattern was sufficiently drilled into Ruda's defensive instincts, Valdez dropped the angle and drove a brutal left hook downstairs into the liver instead. The body shot landed clean, because Ruda's guard and his attention had been completely fixated upward. The liver shot is one of the cruelest punches in boxing precisely because of what happens next, and we'll get into mechanics of that shortly. But what Valdez demonstrated against Rueda is that the most devastating body shots in the sport are rarely thrown in isolation. They're set up, often using the head as a decoy for several rounds before the real target is finally exposed. Not every great finisher relies on a single perfect punch. Some of the most feared men in boxing history built their reputation on something different entirely. Relentless, suffocating volume that simply doesn't allow an opponent room to recover or think. Julio Cesar Chavez, Sr., remains the gold standard for this approach. Against Peter Manfredo, Chavez demonstrated the kind of ruthless finishing instinct that defined his prime years. The moment he sensed Manfredo had been rocked, even slightly, Chavez didn't pace himself or look for a single fight-ending shot. He simply opened the floodgates. What followed was a barrage, reportedly numbering around 41 consecutive unanswered punches, an avalanche of pressure that gave Manfredo no window to reset his balances, compounding body work with massive left hooks upstairs, alternating targets, so that Chacone's guard never had a stable place to settle. As Chacon began descending under the weight of the accumulated punishment, Morales continued landing clean, finishing the sequence as his opponent's legs gave out. What both of these examples reveal is something psychological as much as physical. Continuous, unanswered punishment does more than cause physical damage. It strips away a fighter's control over their own posture, their own balance, their own ability to make defensive decisions in real time. A fighter who is constantly absorbing unanswered shots loses the split-second windows needed to think, to adjust footwork, to reset their guard. Eventually, the body simply stops responding to the brain's instructions in time, and that breakdown of communication between mind and body is often what referees and corners are watching for when they decide enough is enough. Few punches in boxing inspire as much visible suffering as a perfectly placed shot to the liver, and it's worth understanding exactly why the single body shot is so uniquely devastating. Marco Antonio Barrera's body attack against Benavidez offers a clear demonstration of the classic setup. Barrera, a masterful body puncher throughout his career, didn't simply throw the liver shot in isolation. He set it up by first directing a punch upstairs to the head. This forces opponent's attention and guard to shift upward, even momentarily, opening a clear lane below the ribs. It's also worth highlighting a quieter, less dramatic form of body punching that doesn't always produce an immediate knockout, but proves just as important to a fight's outcome. Chavez Sr., again, was a master of this subtler approach. Many of his body shots throughout a fight don't appear to sting an opponent in the moment. They don't produce a dramatic wince or stagger. But thrown consistently, round after round, these shots steadily drain an opponent's baseline stamina and structural durability. By the late rounds, an opponent who absorbed dozens of seemingly unremarkable body shots earlier in the fight often find themselves unable to sustain output or absorb headshots they would have shrugged off in round one. The liver shot that finishes a fight in spectacular fashion gets a highlight reel. But the cumulative, unglamorous body work throughout a fight is often what made that finishing shot possible in the first place. Not every tactical decision works out, and it's worth examining the moments where clever in-ring strategy backfires, sometimes catastrophically. The fight between Luis Alberto Lopez and Michael Conlan provides a kind of stance switching, is that it only works when the fighter executing it maintains the same defensive discipline and balance they have in their natural stance. Fighting from the unnatural stance, Lopez found himself in a vulnerable position, and Conlan capitalized full command and balance. The danger arises when a fighter extends their time in an unfamiliar position to reset, to protect rather than oppress. The fighters who struggle the most are often the ones whose hearts are urging them to keep trading, even as the accumulating damage is quietly telling their brain and body that continuing to stand and fight is no longer the wise choice. The best fighters in history are often defined not just by their power or skill, but by their ability to recognize the exact moment and adjust, even when every competitive instinct is screaming at them to keep pushing forward. We end where every devastating knockout sequence ultimately leads, the moment someone outside the ring has to make the hardest decision in the sport. The fight between Mauricio Lara and Lee Wood remains one of the most talked about examples of a corner's split-second judgment call. As the fight reached a critical and visibly dangerous point, which trainer, Ben Davidson, made a decision to throw in a towel right at the conclusion of the round, a moment that drew immediate and visible protest from Wood himself. In the heat of competition, fighters very rarely believe they should be stopped. Their adrenaline, their pride, Davidson's, is almost always immediate and emotional, especially from the fighter and sometimes from fans watching live. But history has repeatedly shown that the corners willing to make that unpopular call in a moment are often the ones who protect a fighter's long-term health and career longevity, sometimes even saving them from life-altering consequences. And that, ultimately, is a through line connecting every single fight we've broken down today. Whether it's Marquez's patient counterpunching, Canelo's calculated power, Valdez's deceptive setups, the suffocating volume of Chavez and Morales, the brutal mechanics of the liver shot, or the risk of an ill-timed stance switch, every devastating finish in the sport sits on a razor's edge between brilliance and disaster. And when that edge is finally crossed, it's not always a fighter throwing the punches who makes the final call. Sometimes the most important decision of the entire fight belongs to the person standing just outside the ropes, holding a white towel, deciding that protecting a fighter's future is the most important victory of all.